Слава Богу, никогда не пользовался.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get started with our first panel.
Только слышал.
I'll turn it over to Jeff Sutton.
Называется планированием длинных полетов. Какие они при этом выделили позиции? Значит,
Уважаемые дамы и господа, уважаемые коллеги, с большим удовольствием
Gentlemen, dear colleagues,
представляю
it is my
модератора
pleasure
панели номер
to
2,
introduce panel 2 moderator,
Джеффри Саттона,
Dr. Jeffrey
доктор
Sutton.
наук, члена Королевской коллегии терапевтов Канады,
He is the president
председатель правления,
president of the Institute, director of the National Space Biomedical Research Institute, NSBRI.
Саттон играет выдающуюся роль в нашей международной интеграции.
He plays one of the leading roles in our international integration efforts.
Помощь и участие в проекте Марс 500, когда ряд
He participated in Mars 500 project
Соединенных Штатов
when a number of organizations from Russia and US participated in the project,
этих слов мирового уровня.
and
Как исследователь, доктор Саттон
we
специализируется на малых
were able to
медицинских
achieve
системах,
great
на
results.
нейроинформатике и нейровизуализации. Примечательно, что
Dr.
доктор
Sutton deals with neuroinformation, and
доктор медицинских
he
наук
has a
по нейробиологии,
degree
доктор в области
of
теоретической
medical
физики.
doctor and
Все три
theoretical
университета
physics.
города Торонто. Он также
He earned all of
стажировался в
his
области
degrees in
медицины и
Toronto.
хирургии, проходил аспирантскую клиническую практику и
He
подготовку в Гарвардской медицинской школе.
also
Все
studied
эти
at Harvard
образовательные и профессиональные вещи, конечно, делают его
and Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Division of Health Science and Technology. So his educational and experience background, one of the leading experts in this area, he received a lot of awards, including a NASA award, and there's a very long list of awards that also includes the degree from IBMP, which really pleases me. And here's Dr. Jeffrey Sutton.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Igor Bogomolov, for your kind introduction. And as Dr. Rushakov mentioned this morning, there's a logical connection between panels 1 and 2. And so building on the theme of the outstanding panel this morning, planning for long-duration missions, it's complex and there are multiple considerations, and we heard about some of them this morning. There's a need to clearly define the mission objectives, requirements, and constraints, their vehicle and other technical, environmental, life support, and control system issues to address. And meeting the operational objectives and needs requires resources, cooperation. We heard about effective implementation and the ability to handle engineering challenges and off-nominal events. The mission planning must articulate the scientific objectives and priorities and integrate these with the crew capabilities and training and the desire for discovery and high-impact findings. And the crew objectives and integration, communication, and ground support are all important as well. Of course, there are many other considerations for mission planning, whether they're for the upcoming one-year mission of Scott Kelly and Mikhail Kornienko, or for future missions leading to long-duration exploration voyages beyond low Earth orbit. And so inevitably, mission planning is an international activity and one that's both fluid and flexible to handle anticipated events as well as unexpected hurdles and opportunities. And fortunately, we have assembled before us an expert panel to share their insights and wisdom on these and other topics related to planning for long-duration missions. So as far as panel planning goes, just like with a mission, there needs to be fluidity and flexibility. So indeed, there have been a number of changes to the panel, and we look forward to the wonderful views that we're going to hear expressed by this distinguished panel. We ask that each panelist limit their remarks to about 7 to 8 minutes, given the schedule that we're on and the time that's allotted, and that will then leave some time for questions and discussions at the end. So I think we'll just go down the row, and then we have some other folks as well So why don't we start off with you, Dr. Vasilievich?
Hello, I want to say that you are not seeing me, you are seeing distinguished astronaut Boris Maroc, the Deputy Director of IBMP. I am his voice here. I am not presenting in my own, I'm presenting what he delegated me to say. And it's very much related to what you already heard from the first session today. Boris Marokov said that, of course, this annual flight is a big event in the international cooperation. And we're very much interested how much this particular duration could influence many issues from the point of view of physiology, biochemistry, and psychology of the international space crew. But he wanted to reorient a little bit the attention of the audience to the period after the flight. Why we are doing the annual flight? We're doing it because we're looking forward for the interplanetary mission. And what is important in the interplanetary mission? Not just the flight to another planet, but operations made after landing on the planet. And from that point, the idea is very straightforward. Try to reorient our resources and attention a little bit to the state of the astronaut, not from the point of view of his recovery and rehabilitation, but to the point of his capabilities to accomplish professional tasks after landing on another planet. To make it a little bit stronger, I want to just to use the experience of my distinguished colleagues from the Star City. They already studied their own protocol devoted to some complicated operations at the period of shortly after landing. And that means that our side, at least, is going this way. The opportunities, capabilities of the person after the long impact of microgravity to do operations under gravity and to do it at the full strength. That's the point. If you agree with me or not, but as for me, we're not very much, let's say, doing testing and performance testing from that point of view. We are interested if he's healthy or not, but we must be interested if he's capable or not. Immediately after the annual flight, shortly after the annual flight. We can't expect the crew coming to Mars and then wait 1 month or 6 months to recover. That's not reasonable. And moreover, I want to say that Mars 500 was more important, not from the point of view of its duration. It was not about 500 days under isolation. It was about landing in the middle of the mission. If you look at the data of all the specialists who participated, the most interesting period from the point of view of physiology, biochemistry, sleep, was the period immediately before the landing, when the crew was anxious and were nervous how they could accomplish that landing protocol during the landing period and immediately after. So to sum up and finalize that story from, again, not me, but astronaut Morokov, our proposition is very straightforward: to try to create the protocol, including the tasks which could give us the opportunity to answer the question if the crew will be able to do performance, not just tests, immediately after landing, after a long exposure to microgravity. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Next panelist is Dr. Matthias Basner.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you for inviting me to this exciting panel. Obviously, I will give the perspective of a scientist researcher because this is what I do. I guess first and foremost, we need more data. As you know, as all of you know, only a handful of subjects actually have spent more than 6 months in space, and pretty much the same is true for most of our space analog environments. And that's why we desperately need more data, because what we've found in our study so far is that there are huge inter-individual differences in the way that individuals cope with prolonged periods of confinement and isolation that are inherent to exploration mission type spaceflight. And this is actually what we found in the Mars 520 study as well. And to all the other researchers I talked to, this is pretty much what everybody sees in his or her research, that there are these huge inter-individual differences. And we really need to find ways to predict how an individual will react to prolonged periods of confinement and isolation, to select the right crew, to train them properly, and then to provide them with the correct countermeasures when they're on their real mission. But again, we need more data to inform this process. The other thing is that we need data fast. I mean, there's already 2 missions in the planning stage. One is Inspiration Mars, which is about to launch in January 2018. And then there's the Mars 1 project that is supposed to start in 2022. Believe it or not, more than 80,000 people have already signed up for that mission. They want to be part of that mission. That's even more astonishing if you know that you actually have to pay money to sign up for that. And they're actually trying to get 500,000 applicants for that mission. Therefore, I think we really need to perform more simulations of exploration-type missions like Mars 520. And I think these simulations really should use the various space analog environments that are available to us. And as you know, each analog has its characteristic advantages and disadvantages, but I think in their combination, they really complement each other very well and give us a good idea and picture about the most important risk factors inherent to long-duration spaceflight. These studies will also inform spacecraft design and habitability of whatever we send to Mars. And another example for that is what we found in Mars 520 related to the lighting issue, that we really need to have adequate lighting in a spacecraft that simulates Earth light-dark cycle with the proper light intensity and spectral composition to entrain the humans to the period, to the 24-hour period. Obviously, our most important space analog is the International Space Station. It's the only analog right now that has microgravity, which is one of the most important challenges to human physiology during long-duration spaceflight. Also, it has an expiration date. That is, at some point, the ISS will no longer be available to us. And I think this 12-month mission that is planned to launch in March 2015 is a very important and the right step, the step in the right direction. However, I think we should not stop here. We should already right now be planning the next step, even longer missions on the ISS. Probably think about, a simulated mission to Mars on ISS, confining crew members to a smaller portion of the ISS, probably simulating communication delays, etc., etc., as long as the ISS is available to us as a test bed for these exploration-type missions, including the microgravity. I want to stop here and give the other panel members a chance to share their views. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthias. The next speaker, Dr. Valery Bogomolov.
Я постараюсь быть кратким.
I will try to be brief.
Я хочу обратить внимание, что мы сейчас живем в интересное
I wanted to point out that
интересный этап эксплуатации.
we are seeing very interesting times, very interesting stages in ISS operation. We don't have a whole lot of time left on the station because it will remain in orbit until 2020, maybe a little bit longer if we want to be optimistic, but either way, this time is limited. And therefore, ISS partners should do their utmost to try and do as many experiments as we can, and we shouldn't really stick to our segments and pursue our national programs. We should really focus on joint tasks and common goals that would allow us to work together on medical problems, medical issues that all of us deal with and that we will have to deal with during long-duration missions. Of course, there's a lot of red tape in different countries. We have different bureaucracy issues. I think it is extremely important at this stage to evaluate and assess those medical risks that are not altogether clear at this point. And also, we should try to forecast the risks that we may be faced with once we leave the low Earth orbit. And in order for us to do that, we need to plan our research accordingly. And I'm not talking about year-long flights exclusively. I think that all missions that we're planning for the future should have at least some part of it dedicated to integrated research or joint research. And at this point, science research is done separately by partners, even though a lot of times they're done in parallel and pursue the same objectives. However, year-long flights allow us to compare the results from crew members and see how they adjust to microgravity conditions during various duration flights. Moreover, can also use this opportunity to see how the crew can deal with situations when they have to independently or autonomously make decisions in various situations, including off-nominal situations. So there is a number of tasks that we can pursue. Previously, we had a lot of memorandums and agreements in place, and we had directives from our management, which is good because we have support from the management level. And when we talk about long-duration missions, we are interested not only in the mission itself, but also what happens before and after that mission. And we already do a lot of tests in various agencies and jointly after crew members' landings, and I think this work will continue. So I think opportunities are there. We just need to seize them and make sure that whatever time we have left with the ISS is used productively and effectively. Thank you.
Спасибо, Valery. So the next speaker, Professor Inessa Kozlovskaya.
Thank you. So today, I'm usually continuing what Dr. Bogomolov said, and additionally, I will continue what I already started on the previous panel. I agree completely that the task for our long-term flight on извините, я буду говорить по-русски, что основными задачами на МКС сегодня и завтра, собственно говоря, мы уже летаем, и не так много осталось на ней летать.
Are clear because we've already been flying for a while and we have a limited amount of time that we have left on the ISS. So we need to use the ISS as a platform for research and studies that will be necessary tomorrow. As was said before, we have a lot of gaps in our knowledge. And we can't clearly answer how much work we still need to do, because it's a lot. Valery Vasilievich said that it's important to do research not only during flight, but also before and after. And I think post-flight study or analysis should yield results in terms of what kind of condition crew members in when they land. And we should also try to use our research to predict a person's ability to perform tasks after they land on another planet. What will they do when they land in an unfamiliar place and there won't be anyone there to help them out of a capsule and take care of them? How should we plan for that? How much time should we allow for them to recover? What kind of schedule should we design for their work on that planet? So at this point, we can't answer these questions. And personally, I'm very glad that both sides seem to be supportive of the suggestion or the proposal to design a new study or experiment that would focus on receiving quantitative data that will have to predict a person's state and condition at the point of landing and forecast their performance levels. And that's not the only task. It's just one of the tasks that I wanted to mention. Another task or objective is as follows. In order for a person to be able to make decisions and function independently during a mission, they have to be prepared for it and trained for it accordingly. And I have to say that when a cosmonaut or an astronaut becomes part of a long-duration mission, they have to be able to evaluate and prepare for various off-nominal cases. So independently, they should be able to evaluate the situation and come up with a solution. So all of us here are experienced doctors who come up with solutions or make decisions based on supporting data, which means that an astronaut or a cosmonaut who has to make a decision independently has to have some kind of knowledge base or data that they can use to make a decision. And I know that for a long time now,
Вот Гущин, наши психологи
Dr.
занимаются
Gushin and his
подготовкой
colleagues
систем, а мы занимаемся системой
and
создания системы, компьютеризированной системы, которая
people
на
who work
основании
in
определенной батареи
my
тестов
lab
в ходе полета будет определять
design
уровень
a special test
работоспособности, уровень
for
фитнес, так
tests
сказать,
that would
уровень
allow to
его
forecast a
тренированности,
person's
или
fitness
наоборот,
level
детренированности,
at the end of the flight.
и давать ему советы. Мы должны иметь компьютеризированный тренер, коуч, physician, который будет, опять же, иметь всю необходимую информацию, а это значит, с одной стороны, иметь тесты, с другой стороны, иметь всю необходимую информацию о самом космонавте, собранную до полета, на основании которой эта система будет способна давать оценку состояния космонавта.
This is the information that has been collected before the flight. In our lab, we were talking about having a computerized cosmonaut Stepansov on board. Well, Stepansov is not available right now, but we are supposed to create a certain database that will be able to be deployed on a station. I'm saying that we are just working on that as one of the other things that we are working, but we do need to have systems of that nature on board. In fact, we do not really have enough knowledge about capabilities of cosmonauts in flight, because the monitoring system that we have on board ISS is I don't know if you know much about it, but we do have a monitoring system, health monitoring systems. And that allows us to detect any deviations from nominal. Maybe their heart condition, cardiovascular, a little bit respiratory, and that's all. That's all we know. Our monitoring system does not monitor sensory systems, muscular systems. Besides the ergometer board, we have nothing else. Several years ago, we started working with that. We're saying that based on the ergometer data, we are not even able to give recommendations on treadmill exercise. At first, we were not understood. Then a new test was developed, and it is the only test that detects some deconditioning of physical activity, but for gravitational portion only, not for vestibular, however. And we performed quite a lot of research in this area, and we are saying that we are very limited here. So there is a lot of work ahead of us if we are really thinking seriously about future flights, and we need to use our station to maximum for that purpose. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is cosmonaut Miguel Kornienko.
Я постараюсь быть кратким.
I will try to be brief.
То, что касается длительных полетов,
has to do with the long duration flights.
говорил о мониторинге очень
We were
много.
talking about monitoring here.
Я вот как полгода отлетавший на станции, я могу сказать, что
I stayed on the station for half a year.
после 9-месячного
After
перелета на
9
Марс, скажем, если мы имеем
months
это в виду,
flying to
ждать от
Mars,
человека
if we
ничего не
have it,
приходится.
you should not expect much from a
Даже
human
несмотря
being.
на гравитационную составляющую, полегче, да?
Even taking into condition some gravitation that will be to our assistance over there. We have to have a clear understanding here. With the current system of physical exercise designed for the station, we kind of
are getting stuck with it right now.
Это какой-то тупик.
This is some kind of a dead end.
Институтам надо всем нам
The
думать
institutes, the specialists will need to think
космонавт может поддерживать свое
about possibly
физическое состояние.
supporting the physical state and
Нужна более эффективная система
ability to
физических
continue
упражнений.
working
В этом корень.
for long-term flights.
Чтобы чего-то
We
ждать
need
от
to
человека,
have
когда он
more
там на Марс
developed
плюхается, да, и одеть его в
countermeasures
скафандр,
to
чтобы он
expect
там
something
ходил,
from a human being that he
что-то
will
рыл
be
или что-то
able
делал.
to do something on Mars when he gets
Без этого
there.
не обойтись.
We will need to introduce something
Вот это
new,
первое, что
something
хотел
else.
сказать.
This is one thing that I wanted to
Второе,
say.
может быть, по
Secondly,
системам немножко пройтись.
maybe we should go over some
Но
systems
это скорее
here.
технарей касается.
It has to do with engineers mostly.
Наверное, вот. Ну, тем не менее, да.
However,
Вот все высказывают свое мнение, как, да,
everybody can
в таком свободном формате выступаем.
say their opinion,
Есть
and
система
I'll do the
СРУ,
same. There are SRV
Вот она
systems.
существенно
This
сокращает
is the
грузопоток, она существенно облегчает жизнь.
that is
как
producing
любая
water
система,
from
она требует
urine. As
обслуживания, там
any
есть
system,
фильтра,
it
которые
needs to
громоздкие,
be
которые
maintained.
и по
It has
объему, и
bulky
по
filters.
весу.
They weigh a lot.
Вот, а это вода, собственно. Вот
But this
я
is basically
ведра эти
water.
выкидывал в
Okay,
течение
I've
своего
been
полета,
throwing away those buckets of
и мне
urine
было,
for,
пардон, было жалко.
and I was sorry to throw them away.
вода,
This is
это
water. Actually, we're
99%
throwaway
вода,
water,
которую можно пустить в
basically.
систему электрона,
99%
которая будет давать
water
кислород.
that can be introduced into the electron
Надо тут
system to
подумать, как
produce
оптимизировать
oxygen.
вот это дело,
I'm sure there are
потому что
ways
в
to
американском
optimize the
сегменте оно
system. In the
стоит,
US
в нашем,
segment,
к сожалению, не
we do
поставили
have
еще.
it. Unfortunately, the Russian
Не знаю,
segment does not
почему.
have this system yet.
Вот очень хорошая, эффективная система.
And this is a very good, effective
полетов,
system for the
опять же,
US segment. For long-term flights,
Как-то с тряпками нужно решить
we have
проблему.
to resolve things with
Pardon, я
rags.
так,
I'm sorry, I'm talking about rags. Am I funny?
На своем языке, да. Нижнее белье меняется раз в
So,
5 дней.
every 3 days, you change your underwear, right? When you're going to fly to Mars for 9 months, how much of it do you need?
Надо как-то тут тоже
You have to think about it as well. You have to optimize this.
реально, иначе
It's,
это же все это
it's
деньги.
real
это
problems. It's real money
грузопоток,
as
это
well. This is
всё
weight
с собой
that will
волочь
need to
надо.
be brought up as additional cargo to
да.
the station, right? Yes.
Вот те небольшие мысли, которые у меня родились.
Some
И самое
ideas
главное
that I
из них,
came
что
up
нужно
with. The main
оптимизировать
thing is that we need to optimize the system of physical exercise. And for that, we all need to think what needs to be done and how it needs to be done. When I landed, of course, I was able to walk
Так, не торопясь.
slowly.
Но о том, чтобы ходить в скафандре и
However, to walk in a
вести какую-то активную
spacesuit
деятельность,
and be
может
active,
быть, нужна будет какая-то система
maybe some other system will be
адаптации
needed
денька-два,
to
там,
adapt.
чтобы человек
Maybe
в
for a
себя
day or
пришел. Потому
two.
что есть и вестибулярное расстройство,
Because
есть и
there is a vestibular
просто сложно
distortion,
ходить.
and it is difficult to walk.
Но прежде всего,
Anyway,
конечно,
but first of all,
это система упражнений,
this is
которая поможет нам
physical exercise, preventive
держать
measures,
организм
countermeasures that
Вот
would
нам давали
allow our bodies to continue function. We were given 1.5 hours a day for physical exercise. Treadmill, I read, very good machine, by the way. I'm very grateful to the US colleagues to put IRED on board, and we were allowed to use it also. And here all the groups of muscles are getting involved. That's important. So, well, I know you're smart, you'll think about it. I was just thinking about what I would like to have there.
Thanks. Okay. Dr. John Charles.
Thank you, Dr. Sutton. I'm delighted to be here as a panelist at this International Space Medicine Summit, and I'm delighted to be on this panel, a panel of exemplary individuals. And I'm especially delighted to be seated as we are seated here today because Mr. Kornienko, immediately to my left here, will be the crew member, one of the crew member subjects on our upcoming one-year mission. And my colleagues, Dr. Bogomolov and Dr. Kozlovskaya, on the Russian side, are working with us to develop the set of investigations that the one-year crew members are going to be investigating to the benefit of the scientific programs for the mission. So it seems appropriate that we have him bracketed between us here, and he cannot escape. The work that we're talking about doing is heavily dependent on and a variety of logistical kinds of factors, in addition to the factors that Mr. Kornienko just mentioned about life support, water recycling, underwear recycling, and those kind of important issues for successful flights. The kinds of things that I'm compelled to worry about as the chief of the International Science Office of the Human Research Program is the number of subjects that are available for investigation. Because so much of our research depends on repetition to eliminate biological variability, we require multiple measurements on multiple crew member subjects, crew member participants, to resolve the uncertainties and help us understand the actual facts of spaceflight physiological response. The advantage of the kinds of long-duration missions that we're talking about, as Dr. Basner and Dr. Kozlovskaya mentioned, are the ability to acquire more data and the ability to acquire data to make predictions. But I must remind everyone here that long-duration missions are perhaps a mixed blessing. We do acquire data that we could not acquire otherwise by flying shorter missions, but every long-duration crew member is one less short-duration crew member. We have flight programs built on, say, 6-month missions, and in the human research program that I'm a part of, we have mapped out what the experiments that we think we need to accomplish before the end of the space station, say in 2020, and we run out of experimental subjects before we run out before we answer all the questions that we think to need to answer by the time of the end of the space station. If we increase the duration of flights, you decrease the number of subjects, you decrease the throughput. A 1-year mission provides, in this case, say 2 research subjects for 1-year data, but that's at the expense of 2 6-month crew members. And if we have, say, a program of just guessing 3 1-year missions before the end of the space station, that's a total of 6 6-month crew members that will not have flown and on whom data will not have been acquired. I think that's an important number because Dr. Kozlovskaya mentioned during her comments in the first panel that when she started her career in space research, she was assigned to work the 96-day mission and the 140-day mission and the 180-day mission, which, if I guess right, was 6 crew members. And then Dr. Gazenko told her to go ahead and take that database that she'd established and go off and solve problems. So that number of 6, yes? Yes. So that number of 6 turned out to be an appropriate number for solving some problems. And if we focus on 1-year missions at the expense of 6-month missions with a program that does not extend itself beyond 2020, we will be running the risk of reducing our ability to answer questions. That's not fatal, it's not a catastrophe, but what it does require is for us to think about problems in a new way. That is, perhaps we need to get away from the model of having large subject counts for investigations to give us some measure of statistical certainty. Perhaps we need to learn to accept greater uncertainty in our results. Perhaps we need to become comfortable with a smaller strength, a smaller amount of power in our calculations. I am reminded sometimes by my colleagues on the outside that clinical studies in the real world, say medication studies, involve hundreds of subjects. And if we get 6 or 10 or 12 subjects in a spaceflight experiment, we think we're pretty darn lucky. But on the other hand, the real world population contains a much greater diversity of individuals than astronauts are. Astronauts are usually uniquely healthy and generally fairly homogeneous. So it may well be that we can be comfortable with a smaller sample size. But it's just important for all of us to understand that the insights that come with longer missions will be at the expense of some degree of confidence or of some degree of certainty in the findings that we get from both the longer and the shorter duration missions. It will be up to us as a scientific community to reassure our managers and our administrators and our bosses that this is a reasonable trade-off, that we can acquire new insights with a little bit less certainty and still successfully plan and implement the long-duration missions that I think we all look forward to seeing. Thank you, Dr. Sutton.
Thank you. The next panelist is Dr. Cristianato.
Thanks, Jeff. Good afternoon, everyone. It's always a pleasure to be here at ISMS. As you know, NASA will be joining our Russian colleagues in returning to one-year space station missions, an important step in mitigating some fundamental long-duration challenges. And I think countermeasures for human medical problems will be essential. And my new portfolio, the newly identified visual impairment intracranial pressure risk, I think is a prime example of a long-duration in-flight medical risk that may permanently impact crew health and result in the loss of mission objectives. To date, we've identified 6 NASA crew members, and there's been a Russian report that found 8 cosmonauts were found to have papilledema post-flight. This can be a sign of raised intracranial pressure, and over the past 5 years, NASA's characterized additional changes in the eye and the brain that are consistent with increased ICP. 5 of the crew members were found to have elevated ICP post-flight on lumbar puncture, and this hasn't been standardized yet, but we hope to implement an LP study where we can more carefully design the study and when these are taken. Over 70% of assessed NASA ISS crew members, so some of the earlier crew members, we don't have imaging on them, but 70% of those who've been assessed have developed signs of the VIP syndrome. That's approximately 2/3 in the mild category, mild to moderate, while 1/3 have been more severely affected, developing papilledema and or the raised intracranial pressure post-flight. So I think it's important that we not underestimate the potential consequences of the VIP syndrome. And just to give you an example, during one ISS flight, a crew member developed a scotoma, in other words, a blind spot in their visual field, such that they had to turn their head 15 degrees to be able to read a checklist. So you can imagine this is significantly problematic. We also know that prolonged papilledema, which is essentially swelling and edema of the retinal ganglion cells, may lead to permanent visual loss if it lasts long enough. It appears that there may be a dose response. So imagine, if you will, doubling the dose response to 12 months, and if we further increase it on a Mars mission, what might be the potential effects? And of even greater concern are reports of mild cognitive impairment in patients with prolonged intracranial pressure. One of the syndromes that we look at as an analog is idiopathic intracranial hypertension, and it's been documented that some individuals have problems with visual, spatial, and memory in that syndrome. So to mitigate the impact of the VIP syndrome on future long-duration missions, it's necessary to fully characterize the problem, identify susceptibility, and design countermeasures. And I think perhaps as a result of interaction at this meeting, that NASA, Russia, and ESA are now actively engaged on all 3 of these fronts. For example, the ISS Ocular Health Study is going to aid in characterizing the VIP syndrome more clearly by systematically collecting vascular, central nervous system, and ocular data. And this will be done pre-flight, in-flight, and post-flight. And in addition, the Fluid Shift Study, that's a new NRA, which is 3 different studies that we've funded, has as one of its objectives to evaluate the effects of the Russian Chibis-M and that's the LBNP suit, the lower body negative pressure, and the bracelet thigh cuffs on reversing or preventing the VIP syndrome. So NASA and our Russian colleagues are actively engaged in both of these, collaborating both of these investigations, and we'd hope to capture both of the 12-month crew members, again, because there appears to be a dose response. So those 2 would be critical in participating. NASA is also working with our European colleagues, designing studies for the new state-of-the-art NVIHAB facility in Cologne to do bed rest studies, so head down tilt, and monitoring elevated CO2 levels, because as you know, CO2 is elevated on the station. 10 times atmospheric is sort of the mean, with elevations up to 20 times terrestrial levels. And as you may know, CO2 is an extremely potent cerebrovascular dilator. So I think it's through this type of international cooperation that these unique crew health problems will be overcome, and we'll realize successful and historic long-duration missions. So, thank you.
Thanks very much. So, astronaut Mike Fincke.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. And I'm not a medical doctor, but as an engineer and as an astronaut, especially an astronaut like many of my colleagues, both astronauts and cosmonauts who have spent already over 1 year flying in space. I'd like to give you a little bit of a slightly different perspective in terms of planning for these long-duration missions. And it's interesting to see how things have evolved. I remember, was it Shuttle Mir, or Mir Shuttle? And a long-duration mission was considered a couple months. Now we're talking 1 year is a long duration, and 6 months is one of those short-duration missions. So it's interesting to see how we've evolved in our perspective. And then, of course, there's always the long-duration mission aboard space station for 1 year, like Michael and Scott Kelly will be doing, but also the 1 year or longer missions to beyond low Earth orbit. And so there's a lot of planning considerations to think about. I'm sure that the easy planning considerations, such as making sure we have enough food, I think that'll be solved. If not, I don't think Michael or Scott would like that very much. But also the other things that the planning considerations, like the physical considerations, I think we've talked about that. We've managed to solve some of the, not necessarily solve, get a good handle on some of the things that plagued us in the past. We were worried a lot about bone loss. Now we're worried less about it. I'm sure we'll get there with the VIP syndrome that we've been seeing. And I'm terribly hopeful that we'll solve some of the radiation issues that we are currently thinking about and here at NASA and with our Russian partners. So the part that I'd like to talk about in planning, though, is the really important part of the human body, and that's the brain, the psychology. And as we plan for longer missions, we need to evolve, I think, our thoughts a little bit. I think we had I'll speak from a NASA perspective. As we went from the Apollo missions to Skylab, there was a change in thinking of how to plan for a crew to work in these long duration missions of 30, 60, and 90 days. And as we went from a shuttle program to the International Space Station, we had to change how we planned. And as we go from these short 6-month missions to long 1 year missions, I think this planning, we need to think and learn from the past and look towards the future. The real reason is that we want to max perform. I know every astronaut, every cosmonaut up there really wants to do a good job. We very much want to get the most science possible. We want to keep our spacecraft flying, and we need to have the tools to do that. We need to have the right rest and work cycle to do that. And individual results vary, but we need to really think about, for 1 year mission, can you really treat the crew the same as you do for a 6-month mission? Is it, do you, as a planner, think of it as 2 6-month missions, or do you start to think about things, such words that I don't think we've ever used too much for spaceflight, like vacation? I mean, not that they can go anywhere that they aren't any already, but do you let them have a couple days off in a row? I mean, it's going to hurt. It's going to hurt the science. Man, you can't stop a day without science. But on the other hand, by giving us enough rest, we will be able to max perform on our work, and we get the most result at the end. So that's part of the planning perspective, is the psychological perspective, and keeping the human organism at peak performance. Another part that we touched on earlier in this panel was a little bit of autonomy. Right now, because of the nature of our beautiful International Space Station, it's hard for a crew of 6 to pay attention to all the systems, so we let the ground do that work for us, and we're very grateful to our ground control teams. But that also means we also give up our autonomy during the day. In the crew office, working with the international partners, we've worked on making things a little bit flexible when they can be flexible on the timeline. We had a big discussion of what color to make it, so we ended up calling it magenta, but it's really pink. Right now, if you look at a space station timeline, there's pink activities. Well, those are flexible. That flexibility helps keep us to get more done, because we really want to succeed. But also there's other things with the autonomy too, and I think since Expedition 1, we thought we'd be a little bit more like the Starship Enterprise, which movie came out, I guess, today, and a little bit less like just being every minute controlled from the ground. We haven't gotten to that vision yet for good reasons, but as we we need to consider that as we go beyond low Earth orbit, and the delay in communications is going to be longer. Our friends on the ground won't be able to take as good care of us just because of the distance, and we'll have to figure out ways to be more autonomous on board, and the space station's a great proving ground for that. So that's my first point. A second point in terms of planning is, and we can see this coming, it's to harness these new technologies that we keep seeing and hearing about to our advantage. Things I'm talking about things that we don't always worry about, but such as the smartphones and iPads and all these things that we talk about these days. We need to think towards the future, towards that. One good example is we've recently updated the communications infrastructure with the International Space Station. That sounds cool, but what it means is that we have a better bandwidth. We can send more data down, more video, more science down, so that people can get their data faster. And some of the people in this social media sphere, well, they're getting these tweets down, they're getting awesome videos in high definition, and that's capturing the imagination of the planet. We can, for these long missions, whether they're 1 year on the International Space Station or 1 year going to Mars or the Moon, we need to realize that. And I think to NASA's chagrin, today we wish that we had a higher definition camera on the first moon landing. When Neil Armstrong took that step, we had a pretty crummy black and white camera, and I think if everyone went through their minds and said, well, that's not important, and it wasn't. The most important thing is getting the mission done. But when you share that mission, that's what helps capture the imaginations of the people that are paying for it. So let's think about these new technologies to our advantage. One small example, aboard the International Space Station, we've recently started doing something we first saw on the internet. If something breaks at home, like my dishwasher, I can go onto this thing called YouTube, and it'll tell me how to fix it. And it shows me videos, and of course I didn't pay anything for it, so the guy might be lying to me. But still, if I follow along the procedure, I can actually fix my own dishwasher. And I can buy the parts on the internet. It makes life a lot easier, and yet I'm not a trained dishwasher repairman. But I can learn. So we've done that with the International Space Station. We've already grabbed this YouTube kind of idea, and we've started embedding videos of how to do things into the procedure, just like we would do at home. We're able to reduce a little bit of crew training and reduce the amount of errors on board, the amount of time that it takes us to answer a question to the ground. Well, we've actually, a lot of questions are answered because you could see somebody in a video doing it. This is the kind of thing I'm talking about, to harness these new technologies to our advantage. And if we think about it now, ahead of time, we won't have to retrofit so much in the future. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. We have 2 more panelists who are down front, but we'll need a portable microphone to bring down to them.
Actually, one can have my spot.
Okay, if we swap out, then Dr. Igor Bogomolov. No, come. You're on the agenda. No. Please. You're on the agenda. Okay, you want to go? Yeah, come. She's on too, but I'm just going in order.
More time to agree.
Yeah.
Then to talk.
Mike has given up his seat. Oh, yeah. Igor's shy today. I don't know why.
Well, I'm really honored to sit on this chair because Mike, Fincke, and I used to work together long time ago. And of course, since John Charles is my boss, that's why I hesitated to come to the table. I would like to mention maybe another aspect of long-duration mission planning, since we all know that it will be international by nature. And science implementation will have their own challenges. So I think we need to maybe to think about at least I would recommend to think about for research teams, to think about composition of those research teams. Dr. Bosner here and Professor Dinges have a very good ideas how to put this together, because Mars 500, in my experience, they had absolutely the best research and technical teams together. They had all people having their own tests, and they were excellent in that. And the reason for why it's important to have a composition of these research teams for implementation, because we have a NASA excellent structure for like ISS program, we have MOD, but at the same time, we have Russian partners, for example, they have also their own organizations, and they don't match. So as far as the operations on the stations, it's excellently coordinated. But when we're talking about science, we do need to think how to match this together. I would recommend on the early stages, when you think about composition of research and technical teams, to involve people who would understand both cultures and would understand how to work on the other side. And that could be critical at some point. And our Russian colleagues, Dr. Bogomolov and Dr. Kozlovsky, can give you even more of it, since they're trying to implement the science, which is a joint science, and they will be doing. So I think it would be could be a very very critical at some point and important element. Thank you.
Okay. Eugenia Yarmanova, thank you very much for speaking.
It's a pleasure for me as well to sit on the chair that was previously occupied by Mike Fincke and Igor Savelyev. I completely agree with Inessa Benediktovna, who said that long-duration mission would require different hardware. I'm not going to go into detail and not going to list, or maybe I will. It's the equipment that's necessary to monitor cardiovascular system, skeletal muscular system. So it's medical hardware, but also some kind of an automated trainer. All of this will be necessary. So it would make sense to start developing these systems and their usage on the ISS that would allow us to maybe model or simulate Mars mission. And I think it would be useful from the standpoint of training crew members and from the standpoint of working out all the kinks of working with this hardware. In terms of using ISS equipment, I can tell you that a lot of time is required for maintenance and R&R of this equipment. So I think that at the manufacturing stage, we should have requirements according to which maintenance for this equipment or hardware would be necessary only once every 6 months. Because if we have to do maintenance every week, it uses up a lot of crew time. That's not their main objective for being in space. They want to do science. Besides that, in terms of equipment R&R, anything is possible, especially there may be some manufacturing defects, but then also it is important to make sure that our crew members are trained properly, because if they're not trained, then during long-duration missions, ground support or ground operators will not be able to help crew members a whole lot in terms of working with this equipment or how to do its R&R. So when we talk about long-duration missions, our training should maybe be modified. And now going back to what Michael Kornienko was saying, he talked about how it takes a long time to run on a treadmill, for example. But I would like to propose that it doesn't really take a long time. It just seems that it takes a long time. If training for quite a while. You're training inside a confined space, heated between the bathroom and a dinner table, then it seems that you're training forever for very little benefit. So, if we have equipment that allows us to do all the necessary training, and if this equipment is installed in a good environment, then the training will be perceived differently. A person will be enjoying their time jogging on the treadmill, and it won't seem that they're spending forever on a treadmill. So it's a psychological aspect that I think merits some attention. Long-duration missions to other planets will be associated with a lot of issues and challenges, not just the challenges of using clothing and underwear and making sure that we have enough of it, but there are also challenges of making sure we have all the necessary equipment and technology. But I think all of these issues and challenges can be resolved. We just need to do some thinking. Also, since we're talking about science hardware that will be used during long-duration missions in low Earth orbit and during long-duration missions to Mars or other planets, we have to keep in mind that we have to design appropriate procedures for the usage of this equipment, and these procedures have to account for microgravity, because the equipment in microgravity works differently from the way it works on the ground, and then you have to do additional work on this equipment. And so that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank all of the panelists for their remarks, and also to thank them for staying within the allotted time, and thus allowing an opportunity for discussion for 20 to 25 minutes with the audience. So, Jeff, if you want to.
Jeff Hoffman from MIT, former astronaut. 2 questions. On the very first comment about actually testing people and having them perform when they come back, I mean, that's an excellent idea. And my question is, why aren't we doing that now with the 6-month stays on the station? Because we're not going to understand the difference between 6 months and 1 month unless we do the same tests on the people coming back from 6 months. The second question for John Charles, when you were talking about the statistics, I mean, I'm a scientist, I understand the need for statistics in all these studies, but it is true that in the couple of the countermeasures that we've come up with that really, really work, it became evident so quickly, like fluid loading, for instance, before coming back. I mean, it was so evident that it worked that after 1 or 2 flights, crews refused to be the control subjects because the people who were actually doing it were in such better shape. So I don't know if that's a question or a comment, but if we can really develop the good countermeasures, maybe we don't need a huge number of people to verify that they really work.
Especially because we know we are ready to give you all the material that shows that you can see the
May I start answering the first question, not the second one? First of all, I want to say that it's difficult to say why you are not doing something. It's always easier to explain why you're doing something, okay? But what we are doing, let me repeat once again, that Star City, they foresee this problem and already started the protocol of the specialized tests and performance. I want to share this, like Inessa did. I think it's very important to differentiate. First, the testing procedures immediately after landing, which must be very sophisticated and detailed, and real performance that we really require. So they started to test the Russian cosmonauts immediately after landing. Moreover, recently academician Ushakov agreed with Sergei Krikalev that IBMP will participate with their own protocol, and we're using IBMP facilities, including chambers and special equipment based on virtual reality technology. What are the advantages and disadvantages? The advantage is that after landing, astronauts supposed to be in a very controlled environment. Otherwise, it's not scientific. Chambers in the IBMP, they give us that controlled environment for a little bit longer than the flight itself. Secondly, virtual reality allows us to simulate some operations which we cannot do in reality, so we cannot reproduce a moon surface, for example. Virtual reality is good from that point. That's what we are doing. But why we are not doing it in the full scale? That's very clear. We treat astronaut, I'm speaking as a psychologist now, we treat astronaut after landing, not as a human being. We treat him as a mice. From that 100 subjects, 1,000 subjects, give us blood, give us urine, give us interview. No performance. Just testing, and sampling. But again, if we try extended space flights, not as a purpose of all, but as a stage to the interplanetary mission, we have to treat astronaut after the flight as a person who has to continue. And all the examples from the first session when the crew member could not execute the second flight after the first one, when he was not mentally prepared, when he was not physically prepared, it's another story. We have to differentiate the psychological preparedness and physical preparedness, physical fitness and psychological preparedness. That's what Inessa managed to explain when she was talking about sets. Sets means that, for example, we had in IBMP the project with 2 months isolation. They had a crew, and these people they were predisposed to spend 60 days under isolation. It's not so easy, by the way, but it was stopped in the middle due to some technical reasons. That's not important. What is important? The impact of that 1 month was absolutely nothing. And that's only because they try to distribute their efforts for a longer period. So if you are mentally prepared to spend a little bit more, and if you are physically prepared, you can do it. But we are not systematically doing research in this area. That's the case. We're treating them as mice. Give us 1 liter of your blood, 2 liters of your urine, and so on and so forth. That's the answer.
Jeff, can I also answer the first question? I think Dr. Hoffman will be reassured to know that we are indeed executing, shortly after landing, operational light tests. There's a functional task test of Jacob Bloomberg, which is done some hours after landing, but my co-panelist, Dr. Kozlovskaya, is a co-PI on a proposal now wending its way through review to do immediate post-landing measurements at the landing site in Kazakhstan. So we are doing something like that. We will be doing more of that, but the concerns that Dr. Gushin identifies with the controllability, the isolation, the reproducibility of the situation are factors. So the closer we get to the landing, the more varied the variations will be, and that's an issue that we'll have to consider in the interpretation of the data. And in terms of your second question or comment, we long for the obvious solutions, and if they do pop up and we can adopt them based on small sample sizes, I think nobody is reluctant to do that, but they're not all that common. That's the low-hanging fruit, but often the fruit is much higher in the tree.
Okay, Walt Cunningham. Yeah.
Walt Cunningham. I have a couple of comments which are probably along the lines of what Jeff had to say, or they may be more consistent with Mike Fincke, or even you, John Charles, up there. But all day today I've listened to the talk of astronauts, cosmonauts as subjects. And I really question whether we should be looking for the best subjects or we should be looking for overall mission success. And you know, such comments as how do we prepare subjects or how do we predict their success? Well, I have to tell you this, that may discourage many of those who are most qualified to even make application for some of these things. I can assure you that back in the 1960s, that was the case. If this had been the image that they had, a lot of those people, I probably would have been desperate and applied anyway, but I mean, a lot of those people would not have applied to participate in it. And with treating them as subjects, you maybe come up with a lot of academic success, but not necessarily mission success. Surely we all know that prevention is probably the best way to, the earlier you can cure something, that's fine, but maybe we ought to have more focus on dealing with the consequences of long-duration space flight as opposed to trying to just work so hard to head it off. When we go to Mars, as hopefully we will one of these days, I can assure you that that mission is going to be a whole lot more like Apollo than it is like the International Space Station. And you're going to have a different type of person that's going to make that a success. I can't imagine anything much more successful than the Apollo program back in the 1960s. And part of it was because we did not have a driving force on subjects with the American space program. Now, I also know that back in those days, the Russian space program did have a heavy emphasis on the subjects. I just would like to crank that into your thinking, if I might, so that you don't forget that. Thank you.
Jeff, can I say something about that? I hope Colonel Cunningham will be reassured to know that at least in terms of the human research program, the risks that we've identified are those that we believe are critical to mission success for long-duration flights to Mars. I think when we talk about subjects, we have this idea that these are subjects for random hypothesis-driven, curiosity-driven investigations like you might do with mice. I haven't seen much of that in the program I've been associated with. The work that we do is focused on solving problems that we believe will confront the astronauts on these long-duration flights, and we're always glad to be advised when we're misdirected and need to get closer to the ground truth. So I do hope that we don't leave that impression much longer, that we actually can reassure you that we're doing meaningful things and not just curious things.
Okay, I forgot one point I was going to mention. Not that you don't think of this yourself, but it doesn't seem to be getting emphasized. I think part of the reason that we're dealing so much with subjects these days in spacecraft or in the space station is because we now have 100% coverage, air to ground, all the time. So you're not cut out from it, so you can do that. Now, you're also going to have 100% coverage with some delay when you go out to Mars. Back in the days of Apollo, an Earth orbital mission we had 4% of the time we had air to ground coverage. Thank God. Believe me, we appreciated that because it was an imposition on us when we did get air-to-ground communications. So you keep that in mind, and I think we ought to be focusing a lot more on autonomy on any mission out to Mars.
I think that it's about mission structure, and the definition of mission success depends upon the final target. The final target of orbital flight is landing to Earth. So it's over when you landed. The target of mission to the moon is not landing, not the return. The target is the moon. So if you reach the moon, that's a lot. So a lot of people, they can buy that one-way ticket without any, let's say, explanations. They will be happy about that. So it depends upon the target. If the objective is to reach the planet and to do something important there, the returning stage is a little bit different. Where the orbital flight is just the process which continues several months. And then you come back to Earth, and everything is okay. In the flight to the moon or to the Mars, the only thing is important what you have been done on the planet, on another planet. If you reached it, if you accomplish mission, you are a hero. And doesn't matter if you return or if you don't. If you look at the interviews of Alexei Leonov, who was also in the 60s preparing for the Russian mission to the moon, they were ready not to return. So mission success and mission definition is important for the interplanetary mission, but now we're talking about the annual orbital flight in combination with the point that it's for the sake of the interplanetary mission. That's why it's not so easy to differentiate what are the criteria and what is the structure.
Ну, я бы хотел сказать, что
What I wanted to say is that it's a compromise, as it were, between our technical capabilities and astronauts' well-being. We should be creating hardware that the crew will be able to easily use and not vice versa. And I know that right now we don't see this compromise because I know we reached a lot of, or we achieved a lot of progress in our technical capabilities. So going back to the success of a mission, and let's say we're talking about a Mars mission or other space exploration missions, and you're absolutely correct in your comments in that regard. However, from the medical community standpoint, successful mission is a mission that allows for a crew to return back healthy and without any kind of medical impacts. I know that it's something that was studied by and discussed by Dr. Sovin and other doctors who deal with medical ethics. For them, human well-being is a priority above everything else. What I wanted to add is that there's no contradiction between what we're discussing now and what we used to have, because before we had completely different objective, completely different missions. Back then, our main concern was to make sure that the crew member would return back to Earth and would survive the flight. However, there were cases when that didn't happen. But today, are talking about various issues that come up before us, but we have to keep in mind that we're dealing with manned space flight, not a robotic flight. I'm sorry. And I'm sorry, I don't want to disappoint anyone, but if we deal with a manned flight, that means the tasks before us are much more complex and much more difficult. And you know that for the crew members it's very difficult. They will have to spend a very long time in a confined space. We can't even talk about vacation. Their health is not a priority for them. They're trying to achieve their mission objectives. But our discussion today focuses on their well-being. We don't want them to feel like they're imprisoned. We want them to enjoy their work and their mission. And it's important because if they're not enjoying it, then you're not going to receive peak performance.
I'd just like to pile on with what Walt said. Some very important points, and I want to get them out and then maybe have the panel comment. To me, two things are very characteristic about history of the manned space program. One is the most serious events that have happened have been ones that have been unexpected. There was no real training that addressed the casualty that happened or the events that took place. And to follow on with that, any one of us in this room that are familiar with space have seen many, many examples where crews did things on orbit in some circumstance that were judged impossible to get done by the ground, but somehow the crew figured out a way to do that. The issue here is really the synergy between the medical community and the engineers and the operators, because we've got to stop designing equipment. We had equipment on space station that the contractors and the engineers designed specifically so the crew could not get into them. And we did it anyway, and several times things got fixed that were broken, that were fairly essential, in spite of the best efforts of the aerospace industry construct. This has got to change, and it's got to change dramatically if we're going to proceed to Mars. We have to have the crews, as Mike Fincke said, have the ability to fix the washing machine. We have got to design equipment that has this in mind, and we've got to get the training and the procedures and the tools in the mindset that this is what the crew's going to do. But we're not there now. This is why space station is such an important test bed. Yes, it's an orbital platform, but if we do not fix this culture, we will not be successful in doing these longer range explorations. Comments, please.
I have a comment. I want to say that, again, this is a contradiction between the existing reality, that's what we have orbital flights, and our dreams about interplanetary mission. So the reality is that we have the crew fully dependent on Earth, on all the resupplies, on logistics, on consultations for repairment that we heard a couple of minutes ago. At the same time, for the interplanetary mission, we need a sort of adventurous team full of creativity and initiative. And at the same time, the crew, for example, they do not want to lose the permanent contact, as Michael Fincke told us, with the families. So how, for example, to simulate in the orbital flight the communication delay? We have an idea. Let's do it from time to time. And if it will not be for more than, for example, 2 weeks, I think you can do without contacts with friends, then you restore it. But anyhow, there must be elements of the interplanetary mission embedded in the structure of the orbital flight. I don't see any other way to train the crew to make decisions, to be independent, to feel autonomous. For now, what we have absolutely different requirements. They must be obedient, they must follow the instructions, and they must, at the same time, be ready for the off-nominal situations. And as you said, sometimes the crew could do something which looks magical, that they can find decision that mission control can't. But this is a very rare situation. So we're not training people in this way. And this is about the requirements and mission structure. Again, the orbital mission and interplanetary mission have absolutely different psychological structures and different requirements for the crew members. And again, what we are talking about, let's try not just to make this longer flight, but let's try to simulate elements of the interplanetary mission. And let's define what is really possible to simulate in this orbital flight. I just talked about this communication and delays. Let's do it for a short period, but let's try. Let's see how the crew can do on their own, how they can make decisions. But we have to agree that at the same time, you will be autonomous, you will be self-sufficient in decisions, but you will lose the opportunity to permanently talk to your families and friends. So it's not that easy. We can hear the talks in Russian. They are saying, why I have to lose, I'm flying for a year, why I have to lose contact with my family. Absolutely, as a psychologist, 100% agree on that. The 1 year flight is long enough to put additional pressure on the crew. So it's not for this particular flight my proposition. That's to think about because we need to create that concept altogether. And that must be a deep compromise. And again, it's not so easy for, it's difficult already. 1 year is difficult already. And we must be absolutely, let's say, clear. We must understand how difficult it is to spend 1 year in that metal can. And this is at least a very nice experience from all points of view, from medical, from psychological, and we have to be prepared for that. For the annual flight. We are not even prepared 100% for the annual flight. That's what we see now.
Well, I think we've had a really great discussion, which I'm sure will continue into the next sessions. And so I'm sorry to have to kind of bring things to an end at this point. One of the tasks of the moderator is to provide a brief summation. I think that there were some key points that were brought up in this panel. One that we started with is the same point that we really ended with, and that really has to do with the mission. And as we look at these long-duration missions, there's clearly a central issue of autonomy that's paramount. From the medical standpoint, the points were raised regarding the assessment of medical risks where we have uncertainty. Dr. Bogomolov brought up this point, and the need to be able to forecast risks on these new types of long-duration missions and the problems that are associated with them, whether they're VIP or other things that come up. Clearly a need for more data in many research areas. Comes at a cost in terms of the number of participants, but there are lots of examples of success and how this can be done, and the need to develop countermeasures and training that really fit with the mission, and issues will have to be brought up with respect to not only physical but psychological issues, and countermeasures that take advantage of and operations that take advantage of new technologies for procedures. There was a little bit of discussion around individual crew differences and susceptibility at the beginning of the panel, and a lot of focus on the utilization of current resources, analogs, as was brought up with the Mars 500 analog, but particularly with the International Space Station. So with that, I'd like to thank all of the panelists again for their participation. Perhaps we can give them one last round of applause. Okay, this concludes this panel.